So you know that the Army is not funding this because they're trying to help patients or advance medicine.
Right.
It's about biological warfare,
right,
and
wars.
how to protect troops against biological warfare from the other side.
Right, right. Which in essence is an extension of much of what the Germans were doing, who ended up here after through paperclip.
Right.
Was like you say, offensive weapons and then defenses against those same weapons.
And the radiation, the people who were involved in, like the Atomic Energy Commission obviously is involved in the radiation.
Mm-hmm.
But you find that the Atomic Energy Commission is also cross-linked to the U.S. Public Health Service, because as soon as you've got radiation, you've got a health issue.
Sure.
Then the U.S. Public Health Service is next-door neighbor of the Center for Disease Control. So then the Center of Disease Control, U.S. Public Health Service, those are all arms of the government. Well, so is the military, so is the CIA.
Right.
And you find a lot of cross-linking in terms of the actual people running the experiments,
mm-hmm.
the bodies funding the experiments, the journals publishing the experiments. So the mind control experimentation is all interwoven with the radiation, chemical, biological weapons. An example is a guy named William Sweet, who's a neurosurgeon at Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
He's quoted in testimony at the, whatever the name of the committee was, the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation, I think it was called,
right.
The Clinton set up. He's quoted as saying, well, yes, we did do radiation experiments on Harvard using plutonium, and we injected plutonium into people, but they all gave informed consent. Well, a little problem is HP4, which is the code name for one of the subjects,
right.
means human product number 4. So he was the fourth subject in the experiment.
HP4, that's what it was called?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure HP4.
Human product right. number 4.
Yeah.
That's
not exactly
that's
friendly terminology.
Yeah.
So he comes into the emergency department at one of the Harvard hospitals. He's injected with plutonium. This is one of the guys who supposedly gave informed consent.
Right.
But he came in unconscious in a coma as a John Doe. He was never identified. He was injected with plutonium, and he died without coming out of the coma and without being identified.
Right, and somehow throughout that,
informed consent.
Yeah, somehow he gave informed consent throughout that whole thing.
So it's just lying.
Right. Well, hey, that brings a question to mind.
So I just want to let me fill in one more little bit.
Okay, go ahead.
Because it's the cross-link to mind control.
All right, great.
So this same guy, William Sweet, was also in the Harvard brain electrode implant team. So there was brain electrode implant experiments done for sure at Tulane, Yale, and Harvard. And these guys, again, published all this in medical journals.
As early as when?
Back into the early 50s.
Okay, so we're talking, again, as early as the 50s.
And that's really pretty early in the history of modern neurosurgery.
Right, right.
Wilder Penfield, who's really the most famous neurosurgeon, was active in the 30s and 40s. So the neurosurgical techniques hadn't been around that long.
Right, it's almost like as soon as they started doing neurosurgery, they immediately decided to start messing with it too and start trying these implants and things.
So this is funded by CIA, Army, Office of Naval Research. Again, it says it right on the papers that the neurosurgeons published in the main medical journals that I have copies of.
Right.
And a typical experiment is this guy, Jose Delgado at Yale, who supplied equipment to the Harvard team, he implanted a brain electrode in a boy who was 11 years old. And he was the first guy who developed a remote transmitter so he could activate the electrode without having the wire directly connected to the person's skull.
Right.
And he shows pictures in his book and in his medical papers of a 16-year-old girl where you push one button and she's sitting there with this blank grin on her face. Push another button, she's strumming the guitar. Push another button, she's pounding on the wall furiously. All because the different buttons have activated different electrodes that are in her brain.
Right.
And he describes an 11-year-old boy where he would push a certain button and the boy would start saying he thought maybe he was really a girl and he'd like to marry Jose Delgado. And they could just turn this behavior on and off depending on what button they pushed.
And almost in a sort of joking manner almost. I mean, that particular example to me shows that they were just messing. I mean, hey, let's make the little boy say he wants to marry me.
Right.
I mean,
at Tulane, Robert Heath was the guy at Tulane. He put electrodes in part of the brain that's loosely called the pleasure center, and he could stimulate women to orgasm by pushing the button on his machine, and he would watch them writhing. He's watching through a one-way mirror, and they'd be writhing and having an orgasm, and then he would describe that in his medical papers.
I imagine that's probably the only way he was able to do that.
Yeah. And then, so one thing he did was, again, published in a medical journal, he had a guy that he wanted to cure of a mental disease, and the mental disease was homosexuality.
Oh, Christ.
So the American Psychiatric Association defined homosexuality as a mental disease, and so therefore psychiatrists were going to cure it.
Right.
And usually they would try with psychotherapy or some sort of conditioning or something. What he did is he implanted the electrode in this guy's brain, a 19-year-old gay guy, and stimulated his pleasure center just up to near orgasm while he was watching heterosexual pornography over and over and over and over to try and recondition him.
Right.
And then he decided he would let the guy have control of his own transmitter box and have it almost like a beeper on his belt.
Right, so he could hit it whenever he wanted.
They had to take it away from him because he pushed the button 1,500 times in 3 hours. So then after all the conditioning and training, the final test was, this is at a medical school with taxpayer money under the guise of scientific research.
Right.
He hired a prostitute, brought her in, had the guy have sex with the prostitute while he's wired up to the EEG, because they get EEG output.
Right.
He watches the EEG output while they're having sex, and afterwards he debriefs the prostitute and the guy. He says, yeah, it was great. The prostitute said, yeah, I seem to have normal arousal. Prostitute goes away, and then the follow-up is 9 months where he only had 1 or 2 relapses. That is, back into gay behavior. And then we don't know what happened to him after that. And this was a major medical school. And this guy was funded by all branches of the military and the CIA, was a very well-respected guy, published in all the major journals.
Incredible. I mean, it leaves me speechless every time I hear it. It's just incredible. So, incredible. Well, okay, so we have this long history. We have this long history that goes back to the 30s through the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. How far, when did they stop? Did they stop? Do we know if they stopped?
It'd be ongoing right to this very moment, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would have to agree that most likely that's probably the case.
Here's why I think this. If you go back to the MK Ultra documents, which again was 1954 to 1963,
right.
There was 149 different sub-projects under MK Ultra. About kind of half, 2/3 of them were to universities. 1/3 of them were to chemical companies and private manufacturers.
Right.
Just to manufacture chemicals, drugs,
implants, all these sort of things.
Yeah.
Right.
So that was just the sort of technical side of it. But the big chunk of it was contracted out to the universities. And so about 1/3 of the projects total were kind of no big deal, just academic research on this, that, or the other.
Right.
And a lot of those guys didn't know that they were getting CIA money because it was funneled through a front organization.
Exactly, a little cutout.
And the purpose of that was they just kind of threw money all over the place to see if anything came to light. And also they wanted to form relationships with people in case they wanted to actually give them clearance and recruit them in the future. And then about 1/3 of the subjects, the people like Martin Orne and Jolly West and other psychiatrists, had top secret clearance, had signed security oaths and so on, knew it was CIA money, were direct contractors. And they did experiments on hypnosis, sensory deprivation, creating dissociated states, messing around with memories, erasing memories, implanting memories, and also creating the Manchurian Candidate.
Okay.
Not in fiction, but in reality.
All right. Well, I think that's a great place to take another break. We'll take a break here with my guest, Dr. Colin Ross. You can reach Dr. Ross and find out more information about his organization at www.rossinst. I should spell that, www.rossinst.com. radio.com. And we'll be back with Dr. Ross in just a few minutes, and we're going to delve a little bit deeper into the actual mind control side of this whole thing. So far, we've been talking pretty much from a historical perspective, medically. Now we're going to talk about what they actually tried to do to the brain and to the mind. So we'll be back with Dr. Ross in just a moment. Thanks for listening. This is Radio Orbit on KOPN.
So you know that the Army is not funding this because they're trying to help patients or advance medicine.
Right.
It's about biological warfare,
right, fighting
and
wars.
How to protect troops against biological warfare from the other side.
Right, right. Which in essence is an extension of much of what the Germans were doing, who ended up here after through paperclip.
Right.
Was like you say, offensive weapons and then defenses against those same weapons.
And the radiation, the people who are involved in, like the Atomic Energy Commission, obviously is involved in the radiation. This is next door neighbor of the Center for Disease Control. So then the Center of Disease Control, U.S. Public Health Service, those are all arms of the government. Well, so is the military, so is the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
But you find that the Atomic Energy Commission is also cross-linked to the U.S. Public Health Service, because as soon as you've got radiation, you've got a health issue.
Sure.
Then the U.S. Public Health Service